Today we are in Genesis 16, and let's just remember where we're getting up to at the moment. So last week we were thinking about Abraham, who was blessed to be a blessing, yeah? So God came to him and made to him all these promises of place, land, home, provision, wealth, all of these wonderful things, and then also that he would become a nation. He would have children who would become a nation. And what we were saying was that idea of being blessed to be a blessing. I said that in the next few chapters of Genesis, we get to see how well Abraham does. We get to see him encountering different people around him and to see, is he able to be a blessing to them or is he a curse to them? How does he get on in his relationships with others? And so today, the story we've just heard today from Genesis 16 is within his own household. Hagar and her son Ishmael sort of represent these outsiders to him, and we get to see whether he's a blessing to them. And just to cut to the chase, he doesn't do terribly well. He kind of flunks this one, okay? Some of the others he does better. I find Genesis 16 enormously interesting and in lots of ways perplexing, slightly concerning, but also really, really heartwarming. There's loads of good things going on there. When people say to me, why do you love the Bible? What do you love about the Bible? Why do you love reading it and wrestling with it? If I go to answer that question, I might have this story in mind, this passage in mind. I find in the Bible there's lots and lots of strands which are often deeply subversive and surprising and unsettling. And they make you wonder, how did that end up in the Bible? Who put that in there? And it's almost like... Do you know in computer games, I don't actually know anything about computer games, but I read about it once. In computer games, they put Easter eggs. Is this a thing? Yeah, okay, so some people are nodding. Okay, so an Easter egg is like a special thing that you can find in the games. You have to be really keen and you go around and find this Easter. It's not actually an egg. This has got nothing to do with Easter. It's just called an Easter egg. It's a thing that you find. And I feel like the Holy Spirit has put lots of Easter eggs in the Bible, okay? You dig and you dig and you dig, and you're like, oh, wow, there's something special there, and I hadn't noticed it before. And this passage is full of them. Because actually, we're still in this very patriarchal world. You know, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they're even called the patriarchs, you know? And yet we find in this story, it's almost like a proto-feminist theology going on, do you know? And some of the feminist theologians have been very excited about some of the things in here, which we'll see in a minute. Significantly, this passage is about a silenced woman who finds her voice and then names God for us. Okay, this passage is about a silenced woman who finds her voice and then names God for us. And I'm really excited to tell you about it. So again, just to say quickly, Abraham's promised home, property, wealth, long life, and they become a nation. Sarai, remember we talked about the two great sadnesses last week. One of the great sadnesses is that Sarai's not been able to have children. And we're a little bit further along in this story. And not only is she childless, she's also getting pretty old now as well. So it's, you know, the whole deck is stacked against them. And then Sarai says, I've got this plan. And my plan is I've got this slave called Hagar, who's Egyptian. So probably Abraham had bought her for Hagar while they were in Egypt. And we'll do this surrogacy thing. So Abraham, you go and sleep with her. She'll have a child, and that'll be counted as my child. Okay? Anybody thinking, oh, that's interesting? You know, is there something a bit underhand there? Or is there something, there's certainly some ethical questions there, isn't there? But interestingly, the author of the passage just sort of tells us that. So we assume maybe that was kind of a custom at the time. Do you know? Otherwise, it would surprise the writer. They'd say, you know, they'd alert us to it and say, "Ooh, this is a bit interesting." So that's what happens. Abraham goes to Hagar, and she falls pregnant. Okay. And then things start to go wrong because at that point, Hagar begins to see her mistress, Sarai, differently. She looks down on her a different way. Her relationship with her has changed. So Sarai goes to Abraham and says to Abraham, this woman is now looking at me and she's despising me. She's looking at me with contempt. And Abraham takes charge of the situation and says, she's in your hand, you do whatever you think best. There's all sorts of reasons you could fault Abraham, but that would be one of them. And she mistreats her, the passage says, and then Hagar flees, and we find her, the most of the passage happens by a spring in the wilderness in the desert. Okay? Are you with me so far? I've been going quite quickly, but that's all right, yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so let's just pause for a moment and notice this is not a model family, okay? This is the kind of family you could see on daytime TV. Is Jeremy Kyle still a thing? No, okay. So if you remember what Jeremy Kyle was like, where you might have these three people sat on comfortable chairs on the stage, okay? Abraham and Sarai and Hagar, and the strap line on the screen says something like, this woman is his wife's slave and his son's mother, and it was all his wife's idea. Something like that. Can you imagine? They are this imperfect family. And yet they are the imperfect family that God has chosen to do his work in. Actually, God has chosen to do a really special work. He's chosen to do a new thing in them, which is for their good, but also for the good of all the earth. Okay, so let's just notice God has chosen to start in some ways a very messed up family. Think about your own family for a moment. Some of us here feel like we are in dysfunctional families, or we've come from dysfunctional families, and sometimes we feel like that's massively disadvantaged us or continues to disadvantage us. Maybe we come from a place of fighting and jealousy and immaturity and infidelity, and we feel like those things have hamstrung us. So this family that was supposed to be a place of security and safety, a place in which we flourish, feels like it's not been those things. And maybe we've had lots of negative experiences and we feel like they're shaping us and we're carrying them around. It's almost like a burden we're carrying around in front of us. Maybe we feel a lot like Hagar. We've been broken by the injustice of our family. And maybe we think, what could God do with somebody like me? There won't be a role for me in God's kingdom. It can't really be that God loves me, or he wouldn't have let all of this happen. That God doesn't seem to care about what's gone on behind our closed doors at home. Maybe you might think, I don't know how I would fit into the story of what God is doing in the world. I don't think I could fit into it. And this passage actually doesn't really seem to fit into the story of what God is doing in his world, because the story is about Abraham and his home and his family. And so it feels like this story of Hagar and her son, her unborn son in the wilderness, is almost like a bit of a rabbit trail. It doesn't make sense in the whole narrative. Like we want to know how Abraham's finding his home. Why are we hearing about Sarai's slave? This is unimportant. And again, maybe sometimes you feel a bit like that. I just feel like a bit of an irrelevance to the big story of what God is doing. But we've got this whole chapter where the narrator turns our attention to Hagar. And why? Why does the narrator turn our attention to Hagar? Well, because God turns his attention to Hagar. What's going on with Hagar and Ishmael is not something happening off stage. It's something happening center stage. Because God has heard Hagar's misery. God truly sees her. Sarah and Abraham, they'd given up on her. They'd thrown her out of the family or chased her off. But God hasn't done that. God goes out to meet this oppressed one. And then not only does he go to meet her, he treats her completely differently. He treats her uniquely in lots of ways. He treats her specially. So there's at least 6 things that I want to tell you that are remarkable and special about Hagar and what God does for her. Okay? The first thing is, God sends an angel to Hagar. Okay? How many people in the Bible have had angels sent to them so far? None. See? Hagar, this outsider, this oppressed woman, this woman who's fled from her family, is the first person who God sends an angel to. That's the first thing. Okay? The second thing was the first thing the angel says to Hagar. Now, let's just quickly say, at this point in the Bible, especially early in Genesis, when an angel of the Lord is sent, the angel is a messenger from God, but actually when the angel speaks, it's as if God's speaking. There's a blurredness between the angel and God. Does that make sense? Okay, so what was I saying? Oh yeah, what's the first thing the angel stroke God says to Hagar? Do you remember? The very first thing is her name, is Hagar. And it's So when God speaks to Abraham, God just says, go. He doesn't bother saying, Abraham, this is for you. He just starts talking at him. But God speaks Hagar's name. And it's actually the first time in the story that somebody has spoken her name to her. Isn't it powerful when somebody uses your name? Especially if it's somebody who you don't know particularly well, or you don't realize they've remembered your name. Imagine the power of Hagar hearing God speak her name, especially if her name's not often used. So the first thing, she sent an angel. The second thing, God speaks her name. And imagine the power of that. And actually, God speaks her name and then asks her a question. Where have you come from and where are you going? And she begins to answer the question. And actually, that's the first time that we hear her speak. So this is the third thing here. God encounters Hagar and she finds her voice. So far, she's been a voiceless victim. So far, she's not had a speaking part in the story at all. But God, who comes and speaks her name and asks her a question, gives her the space and the grace to find her voice. God will not reduce her to silence. God draws her into conversation. God is this listening presence. We're given this picture in this passage of God as a listening presence who makes space in which we can tell our story and tell who we are. Yeah? Do you remember the question that God asks again? Hagar, where have you come from and where are you going? Where have you come from and where are you going? So the significant thing is Hagar only answers the first question, where have you come from? Because she can tell God what's happened to her. She can tell God all the things that have been going on, but she can't tell God where she's going. She can't talk about what comes next. And I guess that might be how it is when you've experienced something traumatic, is it? You can talk about what's happened, but you can't necessarily see the future. It's difficult to imagine a way forward. It's difficult to have hope for the future. You can talk extensively maybe about what's happened, but perhaps you're lacking in energy to think about what comes next. Have you come across people, and it sometimes feels like they just can't stop talking about what's happened to them. They can't stop talking about the injury or the pain or the injustice. And you know, if you're with somebody like that at the moment, perhaps the most significant thing you can do is just listen and affirm them and let them keep recounting the horrors of what's happened. Because maybe in the telling of their story, maybe that's the beginning of the healing. And if that's you at the moment, if you feel like you could answer the question, where have I come from, what's happened to me, you could talk lots about the things that you've suffered. I'd encourage you to give yourself grace. It's okay if you can't make a plan for what's ahead next. It's okay if you don't know the way forward. That will come in time. Are you with me still? So at least 6 things, remarkable things about Hagar and her encounter with God. An angel sent to her. God speaks her name. God asks her a question, and this voiceless one then finds her voice. And then the 4th thing, God answers there are 2 questions, where have you come from, where are you going? God provides the answer to the 2nd question, okay? God begins to tell her where she's going, what's going to happen next. She can't see that. She can't see what the future is. She can't even imagine a future. But God says there is a future, and he'll be with her in that future. When we think that our past has totally limited what we can become, God comes to us as the God of hope and the God of future. And so God speaks to her these words about her son and the family that she will have, about her offspring. And this is the 5th thing. Hagar is the first woman in the Bible who God makes a promise to. Okay, Hagar is the first woman in the Bible who God promises anything to. And he begins to speak to her about Ishmael, about what he's going to be like. And then we get to the 6th thing, which is the coolest one of all. Okay, so God has spoken Hagar's name. God also then talks about her child, about Ishmael. And then do you notice what happens next? Hagar gives God a name. Hagar gives God a new name. So verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. She said, you are El Rohi. You are El Rohi, which means you are the God who sees. You are the God who sees. She's saying, this is what you're like. This is who you are. You are the God who sees people like me. So Hagar, who's the outsider. Hagar, who's a bit of a subplot. Hagar, who has experienced the messiness of this family. Hagar, who's maybe significantly traumatized. Hagar, who can't imagine a future, reveals God to us. You are the God who sees. You're the God who sees that I've been mistreated by my mistress. You're the God who sees me treated as property, given to another man to have his child. You're the God who sees me driven away into the wilderness. You're the God who sees oppression and injustice and suffering and pain. That's who God is. God is the one who sees those who are oppressed, those who are mistreated, who hears their cries, who sees their misery. And this is the Easter egg in the passage, eh? the woman who just feels like a subplot to the main story, God has seen, and God has seen so significantly that she names him, and that name is recorded for us. And so there are so many people like Hagar who then see themselves in her and imagine themselves into God's story in her. So this is Phyllis Tribble, who's one of those feminist theologians. She said this. She said, all sorts of rejected women find their stories in Hagar. She is the faithful maid exploited, the black woman used by the male and abused by the female of the ruling class, the surrogate mother, the immigrant without legal recourse, the other woman, the runaway youth, the religious fleeing from affliction, the pregnant young woman alone, the expelled wife, the divorced mother with child, the bag lady carrying bread and water, the homeless woman, the needy relying on handouts from the power structures, the benefits mother, and the self-effacing female whose identity shrinks in service to others. All those women find themselves reflected in the story of Hagar, and therefore find themselves in the Bible, find themselves in what God is doing, find their place in what God is doing in the world. Hagar, who realizes that God has seen oppression, and then gives God a new name because of it. Was that 6 things so far? What did I say? An angel was sent to Hagar. Hagar hears God speak her name. Hagar finds her voice. God becomes a listening presence so that she can talk about what's happened to her. God begins to tell her about her future. She's the first woman who's promised anything in the Bible. And then she gives to God this name. You are El Rohi. You are the God who sees. You are the God who sees. Good so far, eh? There's an elephant in the room, which is what God says to her, what God says her future is. Because before he starts promising this bright future about her son, God says, go back to the place of oppression. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. Go back to the place of slavery. Go submit yourself to the one who dehumanized you. I would much rather, if I were God, I would much rather God had said, Hagar, I've prepared a safe place for you and your son, where you can flourish, where you can be completely safe. Or if God said, I'm going to go to Abraham and Sarah and I'm going to rebuke them for the way they've treated you. But actually none of those things, if they happen to have recorded, he just says, go back, go and join the family again. And of course it won't be the same, because now she knows she's not just property of somebody else. She knows she's seen by God and she's a child by God, loved by him. And she knows that she has a place in God's plans for the world in a way that she hadn't known before. And this son that she gives birth to is deeply, deeply loved by his father, Abraham. And, and all the promises made about him, he's not going to bend under oppression. He's not going to submit to injustice. So he's going to have a different experience of life than her experience. But even so, You know, if you read this passage today and you think God is saying you need to go back to the abusive relationship, I suggest you talk to some other people about that. Don't assume that's what's going on there at all. Does that make sense? Be really careful not to tell people to go back on the basis of this story. But as she does go back, this incredible encounter she's had with God in the wilderness will be etched into her family's memory forever. This incredible encounter she's had with God in the wilderness will always remain part of her family's history. And how do I know that? Well, because there's one more name that needs to be given. Okay, so we've heard Hagar's name spoken. We've heard God called El Rohi. Who else still needs a name? The baby. The baby needs a name. And the baby is called Ishmael. Abraham, who is going to love this son so much, we hear that later, gives him the name Ishmael. And where does the name come from? Well, God says to Hagar, your son will be called Ishmael. And what does Ishmael mean? God hears. God hears. God says to Hagar, your son will be called Ishmael because I have heard your misery. So even Abraham, who then gives this name to his firstborn son, knows that Hagar has been seen and heard by God. And can you imagine Hagar with Ishmael pottering around like toddlers do? Every time she speaks his name, she's reminded, oh, I encountered the God who heard my misery. I encountered the God who hears and continues to hear. I encountered this God who saw me and knew me and loved me and provided for me, this God I called El Rohi. So what we can learn from this passage is that God works in far more expansive ways than we expect. We learn that God cares about the subplots. We learn that God sees the strangers, maybe especially those who can't imagine how they fit in. We learn that God doesn't hear the cries of the oppressed and mistreated ones. We learn that God sees misery and God hears pain. And God has promised that he will step in and he will save. This is our God. This is the God we come to worship and receive from today. The God who allows a silenced woman to give him a name. This is our God. The God who allows this silenced woman to give him a name. Why don't we be still and we'll pray.